Well, hello, all you wiretappers out there, coming from the studio of Gangland Wire. Today I want to talk about the identity of two informants that were codenamed Sporting Goods and Romano. These two guys were Chicago outfit connected guys. They were used by the well-known, either loved or hated FBI agent Bill Romer. I think Sam Giancana particularly hated Bill Romer. He was a real aggressive, big guy, had been an athlete in college, and he just drove Sam Giancana crazy. And he was aggressive with all these guys. I know, like here in Kansas City, I got a couple of stories from Bill Owsley and his old partner, Lee Flossie. And Flossie especially, he was an aggressive kind of guy, and he liked to walk up to some of these mobsters, and he'd always get a big cigar, and he'd start talking to them. They'd hang out in the city market, and he'd walk up to them, be talking to them, and he'd take a big drag on that cigar and just blow smoke right in their face if they weren't, cooperating in any manners. FBI agents are a little bit like coppers in some way. They can kind of stretch the rules a little bit, at least of civility. Many say that Romer was a blowhard and he made everything up. He wrote several books, but others would take his facts as gospel. He wrote 5 books, and the publisher labeled all of them as nonfiction, and he did write one novel. I would imagine that all those nonfiction books are like any story that gets told. They're somewhere between total falsehoods, creative memory, and solid facts is what you're going to find in Bill Romer's books, and probably all the true crime books that you ever read, and even all the nonfiction books that you ever read. As I like to say, you never let the facts get in the way of a good story. I've talked with somebody about something we did on the police department, and we each had separate memories, totally opposite almost. So who knows, what the real story was. Those books are, the first one he did is in 1990, Romer, Man Against the Mob, and that basically goes over his career in the Chicago office of the FBI. He was a member of what they called the C1 squad. Here in Kansas City, they called it the 1 squad. It was the organized crime squad. Number 2 book was War of the Godfathers, 1991. Now, this is one I'd never heard about before. The Amazon listing shows that it's about a conflict between Tony Accardo and Bill Bonanno over Las Vegas and getting money out of Las Vegas. And I've ordered it as a used paperback. I want to get that, and I'll probably go through that and do some stories out of it. Now, in it, he creates a name of an agent or the storyteller in it of Bill Richards, but he would admit later that was actually him talking and out of his own experience. Now, his 3rd book was released in 1995. The title of it is Enforcer Spilatro, the Chicago Mob's Man Over Las Vegas. Now, I've got that book. It's got a lot of good stories in it. The ones that I know much about seem pretty true. I've used it whenever I did my stories on Spilatro. This last book is his novel. Can't find it anywhere. The title is Mob Power Plays, The Mob Attempts Control of Congress and Casinos. If any of you guys know about this out there, you got it. I'd be interested to hear about this. Now, law enforcement has always used informants. I use informants. I tell you what, and using informants, especially when you want an ongoing deep throat kind of guy that you can go to for anything at any time. Chicago FBI, the 1 squad and C1 squad have been pretty proficient in using this electronic surveillance. And so now they needed to find a substitute, and they started an aggressive informant development program, and Bill Romer was the guy. He was the most active guy in the development of informants. It takes a certain personality to do that. Everybody can't do that, I've noticed over the years. One of his first ones was former Chicago police officer and also secret member of the outfit, Richard Kane. He worked really hard to recruit Chucky Nicoletti. He probably caused the horrible torture death of bookmaker William Action Jackson when he was trying to recruit him, because these guys, they just show up at your home and go in and talk, or they see you on the street and they're real friendly with you. Or if you're in a joint or something, they'll just walk up to you and start chatting you up till they hopefully, leave you their card. They just do it all the time. Some of these guys like Romer and Owsley was like this. They just constantly going and seeing some of these guys, going to their house. The famous story is Bill Romer would go Sam DiStefano. He was assigned to try to develop Sam DiStefano. And supposedly he'd go in and DiStefano's wife would have made coffee, and they'd give Romer a cup of coffee, and DeStefano later would say they always put pee in the coffee. So I don't know, that it would be something he would do. But, anytime a mob guy sees another mob guy talking with an agent, they get suspicious. It kind of depends on the context, and there's a possibility that they saw Romer talking to Jackson. Well, it probably wasn't the only reason they were suspicious. I remember right, there was other reasons. He was not informing. He was not testifying. One story I read that they saw him coming out of a courthouse up in Milwaukee, the federal courthouse. So they thought he was up there maybe, testifying at a grand jury or seeing agents. It used to be the FBI's offices were always in the federal courthouse. They're not anymore. They're in Kansas City. They got a big fancy new office just outside of downtown with so many safeguards and fences and stuff to keep people out. It's unbelievable. But back in those days, you just walk in the courthouse and there's one floor that would basically be the FBI offices. There'd be some kind of secretary, maybe out front, maybe not, depending on the time of day. And in regards to these FBI agents, they'll never ever mention the name of one of their informants unless that guy's had to testify. It's been brought out in court. Otherwise, they just will refuse to say those names out loud and say that they're informant, which is, rightfully so, because these people have families and extended families. You paint them with this brush of being an informant and maybe they're dead, but once it comes out they're going to have a brother or sister, children, grandchildren out there in the community, and they're going to be ostracized because of that. Now, Bill Romer did leave us some clues to a couple of his main informants. It's kind of an interesting story, and that's the story I really want to share here. One of them was called Sporting Goods. If you follow any of the mob Facebook pages, they'll talk about this every once in a while. A lot of people don't like Bill Romer, so they'll always claim that he made everything up. But he had one that he called Sporting Goods, and he would say in some of his books later on that Sporting Goods was a street boss. And he considered him a source for more than 10 years. He'd been providing tidbits about things from the early 1970s, and Romer would say that he did become almost full-time in 1974. He never mentions his ethnicity, whether he was Italian or Jewish or Peckerwood or what he was. Now, a Chicago outfit, they don't have all Italians in the outfit and who are important people. And a street boss with the outfit would be a guy. If Romer identifies him as a street boss, he'd have to be a guy who managed a crew and directed some venture, like gambling or bookmaking or fencing. A good fence that had a bunch of really good boosters that worked for him. We had some of those here. One of them, Junior Bradley, was not Italian, and he had every good booster in the city going out throughout the Midwest stealing stuff, and then he was fencing it through a store he had. And in Chicago, it'll have to be within an assigned area. Kansas City is not like that. Kansas City is not broken up in these areas. It's all mob territory, one family territory. But in Chicago, they've got the South Side, the North Side, and the Loop for sure. Several of these different crews. There was a Chinatown crew, and all of a sudden I've lost the names of them. A lot of you guys know this better than I do. But there's several different crews, and they had defined geographic areas. It's like nationally. The outfit, the mafia has, the outfit gets Chicago and Sabella gets Kansas City and the Sabella family. And, one family has Cleveland and 5 families have these particular areas in New York. Somebody has some stuff further south of New Jersey. Seemed like the New York families had the northern part of Jersey there. That's basically a suburb of New York. The outfit, unlike the New York families, was not a Cosa Nostra organization from top to bottom. Now, if you remember, Al Capone was from Naples. He wasn't from Sicily. If you're from Naples, you're not going to be a main mafia member. You might be a member of the Camorra, but when you're from Naples, you don't qualify to be a mafia member. Now, one thing he did say that Sporting Goods was not an inducted member of the mafia, or a made guy, as they say. And the outfit had a lot of non-Italian mobsters that were pretty important to him. Jake Guzek, Greasy Thumb, Jake Guzek, Murray the Camel Humphreys, and Gus Alex. Was it Lenny Patrick? They all had crews. They managed others. After Capone, even some of them started out, Guzek was under Capone, and the other two were youngsters when Capone was going out. But all the way up, even Accardo have always given these kinds of guys a lot of power and responsibility because they're really good money makers. Romer would also claim the sporting goods provided the FBI with names of corrupt politicians, corrupt law enforcement members, and just general updating of outfit activity and what individual people were into and who they were, running with and doing business with. And that stuff is invaluable. It may not lead to any direct indictments or even a direct investigation, but you just got to keep up on who's who and who's doing something with somebody else and who they see together more often than not. And then when something else does come up, then you can make sense out of it and who has what part in whatever it is that you start working on. Romer talked about how he and Sporting Goods maintained an ongoing close friendship, and they had dinner supposedly every Friday. I don't know if that meant Friday evening dinner. I don't think I'd want to meet my informant every Friday for dinner, but he'd meet him on Friday almost every week. He even introduced him to his wife. Now, that's something I would never do, but I could see how it could happen. Especially like if your guy's calling you at home, and which he did, and which if you're going to be active and working informants, they got to have your own phone number. Back then we didn't have cell phones. So they had to have your home phone number because they may have something come up in the middle of the night that something's going down and they need to tell you about it, and they may need some help or something. You got to be there. If they're a good informant, you're going to be there for them. So his wife would answer the phone, and she got to know him that way. And supposedly she even joined him for dinner once in a while. Now, Romer would claim later that Sporting Goods suffered a heart attack in the middle 1980s and died. He also claimed that Sporting Goods had once offered to give Romer a large sum of money so he could retire early. So they were like tight. They were, Romer and him obviously had shared some kind of bonds of affection, I would say. I don't think he would lie about that. Maybe he would, but it's like an unnecessary lie and these guys do that all the time. They offer you money or offer you stuff if you're very close to them at all. Other people would say that Romer recalled his death with sadness when he talked about the death of Sporting Goods. He would say later on that Sporting Goods was an older man who was pretty polished and was really intelligent, more intelligent than your normal mobster. He was successful, and it was more like some supposition, maybe Johnny Roselli, but it wasn't him for sure. 1978, before Sporting Goods died, Romer left Chicago, and he would die not too long after that. So if you look back and see who was a street boss during these years and died about this time, again, Johnny Roselli was important, but he wasn't particularly a street boss, and he wasn't particularly in Chicago. He was out in the West Coast all the time. He was the polished, sophisticated kind of guy you might be friends with, but kind of guy you might even introduce your wife to, I guess, but he really was not in Chicago enough. There was a guy there was a street boss at that time who died during that time, maybe a little bit earlier, Dominic DiBella, but he was a real well-known, unpolished guy with a big reputation as a killer, and not the kind of guy you're going to bring around your wife at all. There was a couple of non-Italians, a guy named Les Cruz and Ralph Pierce, who were probably the leading non-Italian members of the outfit in the 70s. Cruz was called Killer Kane Cruz. He was a gambler that oversaw outfit rackets in the suburbs on the north side of Chicago. He would have had an intimate knowledge of what politicians would bribe and who was corrupt and kind of the general day-to-day activities, which is what Sporting Goods provided him with. And he had worked with Murray Humphreys over the years and Gus Alex, who were the noted political fixers for the outfit. The other guy, Ralph Pierce, he was a gambler and a bookmaker, and he had his crew on the south side. He was one of the top Jewish gangsters associated with the outfit during these years. All during his career, Romer claims to have worked really hard to make a case on Ralph Pierce, and he died of a heart attack in 1978. So Pierce is probably the best match who would be Sporting Goods. My money's on Ralph Pierce, mainly because supposedly Romer had talked about and was assigned to make a case on him, and somehow he just never made that case. Romer would describe his other informant in his writings as Romano, and he was a top-tier mobster who was high up in rank in Chicago mob, but he also described him as an inducted LCN member, which means he'd have to be a Sicilian. In his book, Cardo, Romer indicated indirectly that Romano was a capo. He had maybe a couple of crews working for him now. It wasn't Dominic Di Bella, because he wrote when Dominic Di Bella died, he was a capo on the north side, and we weren't able to ascertain who his successor was. So I went to Romano, who was a made guy in the same position as Di Bella, and learned it was Vince Solano. Another interesting fact about this revelation is that just before Di Bella died, the entire hierarchy of the outfit met at a restaurant to pay him some tribute. I believe because he was dying. Now they say it was after Joey Lombardo was made, because he was the only one wearing a suit, and maybe they did both things together. But everybody's seen, if you pay any attention to mob stuff at all, and especially the Chicago outfit Facebook pages, there's a famous picture called The Last Supper Photo, and it was taken just before Di Bella died. And so this guy, who would have been a capo at that time, would have had to have been there at that picture. So then you can start narrowing it down, like, it wasn't Iupa. It wasn't a couple, three others that were there. It wasn't Lombardo, because he had just gotten promoted to capo, I believe, or was he just made? I get those mixed up. Sorry about that. Now, there's one man that is the most possible and probable, I think, and that's Dominic Butch Blase. It's well known that Romano had been kept informed by Romano about Sam Giancana all during the 1960s by somebody who had stayed close to him during that time, and he'd visit him down when he was down in Mexico. And Romano remained close to Giancana all during that time, visited him in Mexico, and then when he came back, he was like his guy back up here. It was 1974. Romer would write about how he dealt with Romano. He said he'd often meet him for dinner, and just, it's kind of interesting. I've done some few things like this. You just talk about the mob in general. And so you state some mob gossip, probably some, something you probably know isn't true. Maybe even you make it up. And then you wait for them to correct you. And then they may correct you, hopefully, and give you what you're after about who's what. You say, well, old Vince Solano, I heard he really wanted to be a capo when Di Bella started getting sick, but I don't think he's going to get it. Romano might say, no, you're wrong on that. He's going to be the next capo. People like to straighten you out. I learned that from an old-time detective in the youth unit. He told me, when you get these kids in here, he said, start talking to them about some kind of crime, the crime that you accuse them of, and then start talking about how it went down, but get all the facts wrong, and pretty soon they're trying to straighten you out. And then pretty soon you get them kind of down that path of straightening you out, and then you come back and say, hey, wait a minute, how'd you know all that? I thought you weren't there. I thought you didn't know anything about that. It's a psychological tool that works. But he didn't want Romano, or who we think is probably Butch Blase, to feel like he was snitching or he was a rat. He just let the guy, let his ego play and let him play it out. I'd written him in as, Romano, an informant, and probably give him what we call a jacket. You write out all the real details and give it to the supervisor and put it in the snitch file, so people, if you leave or something happens to you, people will know who that was. And it gets transferred out of Chicago, I think, to Tucson. And so other FBI agents then knew that this guy had been working for him, and they went to him, and actually they documented this. They didn't say it was Butch Blase, but they said they approached Romano to work with him, and he went off on him. He said, I'd never been an informant. I'd never met that Bill Romer. I don't know what you're talking about. And so then the FBI started pressuring him a little bit, figuring, well, he's weak. So they put him in jail for a while for refusing to cooperate with a grand jury investigation, but they never could break him down. Now, they say Chucky English might have met the description too, but my money's on Blase. I think mainly because of Giancana, and somebody's researched into this, and they pulled up a bunch of old Giancana reports, and there was a particular informant that was talking to Bill Romer about Giancana right around when he was in Mexico and when he first returned. And as you know, if you know anything about the murder of Sam Giancana, who had been the boss, he was a guy that Bobby Kennedy got after he got promoted to boss. And they were after him so hard, that's the one they did lockstep on, where they just followed him and got on the golf course. They'd be the foursome right behind him and drive up into him. I'm sure that was Romer, and followed him, right on his bumper everywhere he went. And he'd go out to Las Vegas. He had a girlfriend out there, was it McGuire sisters, and They embarrassed him in front of her and things like that. And he finally went to Mexico. He had other action going in other parts of the world, really, and had some casino action, I think, in the Caribbean, maybe even a casino in Iran. I can't remember exactly, but he had other gambling action going, but he was out of it as far as the outfit was concerned. Then he comes back. And Blasi's his buddy when he comes back, but Blasi, Accardo, and Iupa, they didn't really want him to come back in, and he was trying to come back in. And his man, Richard Kane, I think, was working with him on that because somebody killed Richard Kane. That's when it came out that he had been one of Romero's. He'd been one of Romer's informants. And Blasi was the last guy to see Giancana alive that night when he was killed. He'd been over to his house earlier. And they say that the surveillance got pulled off and Blasi came back and killed him and then left again. He was never charged with the murder. Nobody was ever charged with that murder. But, he met with Romer. Romer would report that he met with Blasi the very next day. And Butch would claim that Sam was peaceful and content when he died, but that outside forces had killed him. And, that whole CIA thing was going on at the time, and that's when they killed Rosselli, because those guys kind of tried to work with the CIA and kill Castro, and the old school outfit guys in Chicago, Accardo and them, they did not like that. They didn't think you should have anything to do with it. Nick Savella was like that. He didn't even like anybody even talking to an agent, even like in any manner at all. He refused to speak to you. He was just, get out of here. I'm not talking to you. You couldn't get him to strike up a small talk or anything. A lot of these guys, you can get them to strike up small talk, joke about something. But Accardo did not like that, and Giancana was not like that, but apparently Blasi was. So my money's on Blasi, and Blasi ended up dying a natural death. So that was the story of Sporting Goods and Romano. Bill Romer was an interesting guy. I tell you what, regardless of what you think, there's a lot of good facts in his books. He had a prodigious memory to remember all. And if he's like Owsley, he copied a lot of stuff and took it home so he could refer back to his old reports and things like that. I know Bill really, he had a great memory, one of the best memories I ever heard, but he also brought a lot of stuff home. Then he did a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests to help write his books, and Romer probably did the same thing. And then he's really close with a lot of other agents, so what he couldn't remember, he could call them up and they would talk to him about that. So that's the story of Bill Romer and his two main informants, Romano and Sporting Goods. Thanks, folks.